Hey everyone, Minutia Minute here, coming at you guys with another week in the 365 movie challenge. This week, I'm watching 7 John Woo movies, which I will be presenting to you guys in chronological order. And I'm really curious to see what you guys think about John Woo down in the comments, because I think he's someone who, he was a super hot director for a while. He came to America from Hong Kong, and his style over time maybe became a little bit divisive, maybe a little bit played out. He's one of those directors you kind of either love him or you hate him. For me, he falls in the love him category. I grew up on John Woo movies actually, and I just love their style and ambition. He's someone who, for a lot of his career at least, was always functioning like 5% beyond his actual capabilities as a filmmaker. So some of his older movies, especially, are kind of filled with flubs and gaffes and sloppiness, but the effort is all on screen. Sadly, after leaving Hong Kong, kind of at the height of his powers, he was somewhat gimped in Hollywood, kind of went through the Jackie Chan thing where Hollywood just didn't quite know how to handle him as a filmmaker and how to play to his strengths. But he really wasn't here for that long. He basically made films for about 10 years in the US and then ultimately went back to Asia, where he still is today, kind of in the later part of his career. And I think some of his output since he's left America has definitely outpaced what he was doing while he was here. So it's kind of too bad that, really the golden era of his career kind of got cut short just because he ended up coming to America. Now, obviously, there's a lot of complication in that. He was a filmmaker in Hong Kong, and there was a lot of uncertainty around Hong Kong going back to China, and so there were a lot of artists and a lot of filmmakers coming out of that area, moving to America looking for a new place. And it's too bad we weren't really able to give him the platform that he deserved. Nevertheless, I've seen a lot of John Woo movies in my day. My first encounter with the director, believe it or not, was Mission Impossible 2, which probably isn't the best first outing. But even so, when it's your first John Woo movie, like, there's no mistaking the style, the action, the gunplay, the soundtrack. From there, I started reading about him, which he was pretty heavily featured in this Hong Kong action cinema guidebook, which I found pretty indispensable back in the day. Tons and tons of great information in here, going through things like the Shaw Brothers, from ghost to horror to action. There's Michelle Yeoh. And then here, of course, the ballistic ballad of John Woo. This book went through A Better Tomorrow, it went through The Killer, Hard Boiled, all kinds of great stuff. For those of you guys who are Criterion fanatics, I did get my copy of The Killer from the Criterion Collection. And yes, I do have Hard Boiled as well. For a few years in the early 2000s, anything John Woo did, I was absolutely stoked to see. When Paycheck came out, that kind of caused me to cool off on John Woo a little bit. And while I still liked the John Woo movies that I hadn't really continued to seek out more classic John Woo work. Until a couple years ago, when I went back and started looking through some of his filmography and slowly but surely picking up some John Woo titles that I hadn't seen before. First up, we're going to talk about 1986's Once a Thief. This movie stars Chow Yun-fat, and unfortunately, I don't know the name of this actor here, but both of these guys are kind of John Woo regulars. They were both in the A Better Tomorrow movies. And this was a fun, albeit sort of fluffy first film to watch. It basically tells the story of a couple of professional thieves that are hired to steal a painting. And of course, the film is filled with extravagant heists, some fantastic stunts. Chow Yun-fat parachutes into their car while they're driving down the road when he's making his getaway. The set pieces in this movie actually really shine because they do a lot of outdoor stunt work with trucks, planes, helicopters, all that kind of stuff that just makes for kind of a fun spectacle. The interpersonal relationships in this I thought were fine. You have kind of a classic John Woo love triangle in which, two best friends are in love with the same woman, and when Chow Yun-fat is believed to be dead, sacrificing himself for his best friend. The best friend ends up with the love of Chow Yun-fat's life, which of course leads to some interpersonal drama when you get later into the film and you discover that Chow Yun-fat is alive. But yeah, overall this was a solid start to John Woo week. It was certainly not the best movie I watched, but not the worst. It was fun. As you can see here, I have the Nova release of the film, which frankly is not my favorite. It does have like a nice slipcover and everything. You've got the Chinese artwork on the inside. You open it up, and you do have art on the interior sleeve as well. And then you've got, of course, the disc. It looks nice on the surface, but the transfer quality on this is pretty terrible. I'm not sure if there's anything better out there or not. This is just what I had access to at the time when I bought it. Honestly, all of the Nova Media releases from this era share a consistent low quality. Next up was another Nova Media release, and that was Bullet to the Head, which is probably one of John Woo's more famous films from Hong Kong in this era. This is a very heavy movie, basically the exact opposite of everything I just said about Once a Thief. This movie follows three brothers who are living in Hong Kong, want to make it big, are kind of swept up in the criminal element, and are convinced to go to Saigon. This movie takes place in the 60s, to kind of try and make their fortune. They're sent there to buy penicillin, and they end up basically ripping off their contact, stealing a bunch of gold from him, and you basically spend the movie watching them try and navigate Saigon in the middle of a war, stuck between the Americans and the Viet Cong, ultimately captured as prisoners of war, and their friendship falling apart throughout the course of the movie. Very, very heavy stuff. John Woo does not pull punches when he shows war on film. So there's this interesting balancing act going on where you have people flying around on cables and the ridiculous gunfights, but also very graphic violence with children that you would think doesn't go together. But John Woo's visual style is so operatic that the whole thing actually hits you really hard. It's the exact opposite of the sort of grimdark realism of like a Saving Private Ryan. In this, it's absurd and over the top, but the elements that John Woo chooses to show you hits you in your gut and really sticks with you. Bullet to the Head probably wasn't my favorite watch of the week, but it probably was his best movie. So just really quick, again, this is another Nova release, so it does have a nice slipcover. It fits pretty tight. I don't know if you noticed that with the other one as well. You've got the Chinese artwork on the inside. Open it up. This one actually has some art cards. I'm not going to take these out. They're just kind of still shots from the movie. Honestly, I wouldn't want to spoil it if you ever watch it because there's some spoilers on these cards. You do have some artwork on the inside. It looks like a nice release, but again, the transfer quality is really terrible. And there's some weird motion blurring issues with this release in particular. I noticed it with A Better Tomorrow as well. That definitely doesn't make it the best way to watch the movie, but I don't know of a better way, so it's what I have. Switching over to American movies, there was actually only one American John Woo movie I had never seen, and that was Hard Target. This was his first American film. It stars Jean-Claude Van Damme. He has a tremendously awful mullet in it that looks like it has been glued in place. While this has a lot of the John Woo flourishes, this is produced by Sam Raimi, and it definitely had a strong influence of the Raimi directorial flourishes in it as well, which was kind of interesting. I don't know how hands-on Sam Raimi was in making this movie, but in particular, there's a lot of bow and arrow action in this, in which the camera is affixed to the side of the arrow as it's traveling through the air, very much like, the projectile eyeball in Evil Dead 2. Overall, the plot of this is pretty forgettable. It's kind of like a Most Dangerous Game type movie, and it ultimately leads to a pretty great motorcycle chase in the middle of the movie that feels very classic John Woo, gets your blood pumping, and then kind of slows down to some over-the-top, kind of yawn-inducing gunplay sequences towards the end at like an abandoned carnival. It was kind of unclear. It's like a carnival storage shed of some kind. The geography in this movie is pretty confusing, to be honest. Overall, the biggest problem with this movie is, Jean-Claude Van Damme and John Woo don't make for a great pair. And the reason for that is Jean-Claude Van Damme is fast. He's an action star who can execute moves in 2 frames of film. And that's like the appeal of Jean-Claude Van Damme as a martial artist. And John Woo, on the other hand, is like the Godfather King of slow-mo. And so the two of those things just don't mesh very well. And a lot of the cool things that Jean-Claude Van Damme does, John Woo slows way down. And watching someone kick really slowly doesn't have the same effect as when it happens in the flash of an eye. Overall, Hard Target really felt like a failed experiment and was easily my least favorite movie of the week. Now, I did watch one other American John Woo film, which, as I said, I've seen all the others, so this is technically my rewatch, although I watched the director's cut of this for the first time. So you might say this is my rewatch of the week, or you might say that this is a new film. Honestly, I don't know. It didn't feel that particularly different. Although I will say I did enjoy this more the second time, probably because I went in expecting to be disappointed. Although the director's cut maybe added something extra that I just didn't remember not seeing. Coming in at a solid 2.5 hours, this movie is definitely way longer than it needs to be. The thing that was interesting about watching Windtalkers this time is, in a weird way, this is like John Woo's romantic comedy. And the reason is because this movie really doesn't have a traditional plot. It actually follows the structure of like Notting Hill. Basically, the first act of the movie, you follow Nicolas Cage, who is a soldier that was injured in battle. He's somewhat washed up. He's trying to get back on his feet. Simultaneously, you're following Adam Beach's character, who is a Navajo code talker. He's being trained to be a code talker. He is bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, excited to serve his country. Midway through the first act, these two characters meet up. They don't get along. They have nothing in common. And then throughout the course of the movie, they're basically fighting from one side of an island in the Pacific to the other. And again, there's no real plot. There's no real goal. They're just kind of in combat. And that's kind of like these two characters dating. And really the only developments that happen are character driven, in which Nicolas Cage and Adam Beach slowly come to understand each other, get along, fall in love, quote unquote. And then about 3/4 of the way through the movie, something happens in which they realize, maybe I don't know you that well. Maybe we don't really get along. Maybe actually I hate you, and I hate you back. And through a misunderstanding and a long-kept secret on Nicolas Cage's side, they have a huge falling out that dovetails very nicely into them getting back together in the last 5 minutes. This movie's pretty dull. The action in it is really spectacular. John Woo is working with tons and tons of extras with the support of pretty strategically used CGI. You can't deny that Windtalkers is a spectacle. I would have liked this movie more if they spent more time on the actual concept of like the Navajo code talkers. It would have been nice to have really learned something about them and their situation in the war. Or at the very least, if the movie had had some kind of a driving plot. They had to get to the other side of this beach because X was going to happen, or they were going to steal X from the enemy, like something more. Pretty interesting characters, actually, from Nicolas Cage and Adam Beach. They make for a good dynamic, but that's really all you have. So you're left with this sort of weird romantic comedy structure that works if it's a 90-minute romantic comedy, not if it's a 2.5 hour war epic. All right, next up, we have John Woo back in Asia for a double feature, which is Red Cliff Part 1 and Red Cliff Part 2. If you're a fan of John Woo's American output, you usually think of him as the master of gun fu and not so much historical epics. But Red Cliff actually isn't unique to his filmography. A lot of his early work is much more in this vein. I have seen The Hand of Death, which is his first film. It's also Jackie Chan's first film. It's a total blast to watch. It kind of gives you Kung Pao Enter the Fist vibes because it's coming from that era, and has a very similar sort of Rocky-esque structure to it, but definitely highly entertaining. I have not seen Last Hurrah for Chivalry. That was on my list for this week, and I didn't quite get to it because I already filled up my itinerary. So yeah, John Woo actually has a pretty decent output of films taking place in ancient China. And I'm very excited to report that Red Cliff definitely seems to be the final word on that genre in John Woo's filmography. I would say Red Cliff Part 1 and 2, hands down, were my favorite watches of the week. Without a doubt, these two films are clearly directed by someone whose last movie was Paycheck, and he really had something to prove, and the handcuffs were finally off. Um, it's just an incredible movie. All of the spectacle and epicness that you got from Windtalkers, but now in ancient China telling the romance of the three kingdoms. The situations they have to overcome are interesting, and they do so in very creative, clever ways that makes you excited to see what's going to come next and how they're going to overcome it. So if you think of this as one long movie, this is almost 5 hours. Both movies are 2.5 hours or 2 hours 25 minutes, so very close to 5 hours. But it really doesn't feel the runtime. Like, I had a tremendous amount of fun just sitting, absorbing the world. This film does have some kind of clunky, cliche transitions in it that are a bit flashier than they need to be and draw undue attention to themselves. But other than that, this also might be one of John Woo's best directorial efforts, strictly from a technical perspective. And yes, I am counting this as two movies because they were released separately as 2.5 hour films. Alright, so that just leaves one more movie from John Woo. This is another Asian film. It's actually a Korean, Japanese, Chinese co-production, and that is 2017's Manhunt. This, as you can tell from the cover, was very much a return to John Woo as the master of gun fu. Similar to Once a Thief, this movie feels a little bit frivolous, a little bit potboiler, but it ultimately has that John Woo flair that makes it entertaining, fun to watch. Like, if you're a hardcore John Woo fan, you're really going to enjoy this movie. If you're not, this movie isn't going to sell you on his style. This movie tells the story of a lawyer who's framed for a murder. He ends up forming an unlikely alliance with the detective that's been sent to bring him in, and after pulling a series of strings, you find out that this pharmaceutical company is behind everything, and they have this nefarious plot to create basically super soldier serum. There is an element of like comic book superhero film in this, although it's mostly used as an excuse for some wirework fist fighting more than anything particularly super heroic. John Woo described this film as being in the mold of Hard Boiled. I would definitely disagree with that. It feels to me much more like the Asian version of like a Face Off or a Paycheck, where you have sort of this sci-fi element, but it doesn't really quite rise to the occasion of a high concept action film. The big thing holding this movie back is probably the first half, in which it does feel very potboiler. You know, you're following the fugitive, you're following the cop. Once they kind of get together, the action picks up. There's a fantastic action sequence on a farm that feels like classic John Woo to me, and you start getting a better handle on some of the more absurd aspects of the plot that causes the film to become a lot more fun than the first half was. I did find out that I unintentionally broke my rule in that this is a remake of a film from 1976. I definitely need to try and get that movie. I have no idea if it's anything like this movie. I would imagine that it's not, but who knows? I'd be curious to find out. But despite being a remake, it definitely felt like a solid conclusion to John Woo Week. I definitely get the feeling after watching this that we are past John Woo in his prime. This film is clearly shot on digital video, and it's pretty ugly to look at. You know, the camera moves are somewhat there, but he's just not quite operating in the same element that he used to. And, you know, some of the old tricks don't land quite the same way that they did in the 80s and 90s. Alright guys, so that wraps up John Woo Week. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you've never seen a John Woo movie, I do strongly recommend you give it a chance. He is certainly someone where it's like you love it or you hate it, but there are some classic movies that I think, any film fan should watch. If you don't like subtitles, I would definitely recommend checking out Face Off. But if you don't mind reading while watching your movies, Bullet in the Head is fantastic, a masterpiece. I would say Hard Boiled, The Killer, Red Cliff, so many great movies out there to watch and discover. So go check them out. If you've seen any of these movies, let me know what you thought of them in the comments down below. And I hope you guys have a great week in movies. Thanks for watching, guys.